Unless otherwise specified, Chinese texts in this article are written in format. In cases where Simplified and Traditional Chinese scripts are identical, the Chinese term is written once. Chinese is a group of related but in many cases mutually unintelligible language varieties, forming a branch of the Sino-Tibetan language family. Chinese is spoken by the Han majority and many other ethnic groups in China. Nearly 1.2 billion people speak some form of Chinese as their first language. The varieties of Chinese are usually described by native speakers as dialects of a single Chinese language. But linguists note that they are as diverse as a language family. The internal diversity of Chinese has been likened to that of the Romance languages, but may be even more varied. There are between 7 and 13 main regional groups of Chinese, of which the most spoken by far is Mandarin, followed by Wu, Yu and Min. Most of these groups are mutually unintelligible, although some, like Xiang and the Southwest Mandarin dialects, may share common terms and some degree of intelligibility. All varieties of Chinese are tonal and analytic. Standard Chinese is a standardized form of spoken Chinese based on the Beijing dialect of Mandarin. It is the official language of China and Taiwan, as well as one of 4 official languages of Singapore. It is one of the 6 official languages of the United Nations. The written form of the standard language, based on the logograms known as Chinese characters, is shared by literate speakers of otherwise unintelligible dialects. Of the other varieties of Chinese, Cantonese is influential in Guangdong Province and in Hong Kong and Macau, and is widely spoken among overseas communities. Minnan, part of the Min group, is widely spoken in southern Fujian, in neighboring Taiwan and in Southeast Asia. There are also sizable Hakka and Shanghainese diasporas, for example in Taiwan, where most Hakka communities are also conversant in Taiwanese and Standard Chinese. History. Chinese can be traced back over 3,000 years to the first written records, and even earlier to a hypothetical Sino-Tibetan proto-language. The language has evolved over time, with various local varieties becoming mutually unintelligible. In reaction, central governments have repeatedly sought to promulgate a unified standard. Origins. Most linguists classify all varieties of Chinese as part of the Sino-Tibetan language family, together with Burmese, Tibetan and many other languages spoken in the Himalayas and the Southeast Asian Massif. Although the relationship was first proposed in the early 19th century and is now broadly accepted, reconstruction of Sino-Tibetan is much less developed than for families such as Indo-European or Austroasiatic. Difficulties have included the great diversity of the languages, the lack of inflection in many of them, and the effects of language contact. In addition, many of the smaller languages are spoken in mountainous areas that are difficult to reach, and are often also sensitive border zones. Without a secure reconstruction of Proto-Sino-Tibetan, the higher-level structure of the family remains unclear. A top-level branching into Chinese and Tibeto-Burman languages is often assumed, but has not been convincingly demonstrated. Old and Middle Chinese. The earliest examples of Chinese are divinatory inscriptions on oracle bones from around 1250 BCE in the late Shang dynasty. Old Chinese was the language of the Western Zhou period, recorded in inscriptions on bronze artifacts, the classic of poetry and portions of the Book of Documents and I Ching. Scholars have attempted to reconstruct the phonology of Old Chinese by comparing later varieties of Chinese with the rhyming practice of the classic of poetry and the phonetic elements found in the majority of Chinese characters. Although many of the finer details remain unclear, most scholars agree that Old Chinese differed from Middle Chinese in lacking retroflex and palatal obstruents but having initial consonant clusters of some sort, and in having voiceless nasals and liquids. Most recent reconstructions also describe an atonal language with consonant clusters at the end of the syllable, developing into tone distinctions in Middle Chinese. Several derivational affixes have also been identified, but the language lacked inflection, and indicated grammatical relationships using word order and grammatical particles. Middle Chinese was the language used during Northern and Southern dynasties and the Sui, Tang, and Song dynasties. It can be divided into an early period, reflected by the Qiuyuan rhyme book, and a late period in the 10th century, reflected by rhyme tables such as the Yunjing, constructed by ancient Chinese philologists as a guide to the Qiuyuan system. These works define phonological categories, but with little hint of what sounds they represent. Linguists have identified these sounds by comparing the categories with pronunciations in modern varieties of Chinese, borrowed Chinese words in Japanese, Vietnamese, and Korean, and transcription evidence. The resulting system is very complex, with a large number of consonants and vowels, but they were probably not all distinguished in any single dialect. Most linguists now believe it represents a dia system encompassing 6th century Northern and Southern standards for reading the classics. Rise of Northern dialects after the fall of the Northern Song dynasty, and during the reign of the Jin and Yuan dynasties in northern China. A common speech developed based on the dialects of the North China Plain around the capital. The Zhongyuan Pinyin was a dictionary that codified the rhyming conventions of New Sank verse form in this language, together with the slightly later Menguzian. This dictionary describes a language with many of the features characteristic of modern Mandarin dialects. Until the mid-20th century, most of the Chinese people living in many parts of southern China spoke only their local language. As a practical measure, officials of the Ming and Qing dynasties carried out the administration of the empire using a common language based on Mandarin varieties, known as Guanhua. For most of this period, this language was a Coney based on dialects spoken in the Nanjing area, though not identical to any single dialect. By the middle of the 19th century, the Beijing dialect had become dominant and was essential for any business with the imperial court. In the 1930s, a standard national language Guoyu was adopted. After much dispute between proponents of northern and southern dialects and an abortive attempt at an artificial pronunciation, the National Language Unification Commission finally settled on the Beijing dialect in 1932. The People's Republic, founded in 1949, retained this standard, calling it Putonghua. The national language is now used in education, the media, and formal situations in both mainland China and Taiwan. In Hong Kong and Macau, because of their colonial and linguistic history, the language of education, the media, formal speech, and everyday life remains the local Cantonese, although the standard language is now very influential and taught in schools. Influence. The Chinese language has spread to neighboring countries through a variety of means. Northern Vietnam was incorporated into the Han Empire in 111 BCE, beginning a period of Chinese control that ran almost continuously for a millennium. The four commanderies were established in northern Korea in the 1st century BCE, but disintegrated in the following centuries. Chinese Buddhism spread over East Asia between the 2nd and 5th centuries CE, and with it the study of scriptures and literature in literary Chinese. Later Korea, Japan, and Vietnam developed strong central governments modeled on Chinese institutions, with literary Chinese as the language of administration and scholarship, a position it would retain until the late 19th century in Korea and Japan, and the early 20th century in Vietnam. Scholars from different lands could communicate, albeit only in writing, using literary Chinese. Although they used Chinese solely for written communication, each country had its own tradition of reading texts aloud, the so-called Sino-Xenic pronunciations. Chinese words with these pronunciations were also borrowed extensively into the Korean, Japanese and Vietnamese languages, and today comprise over half their vocabularies. This massive influx led to changes in the phonological structure of the languages. contributing to the development of moraic structure in Japanese and the disruption of vowel harmony in Korean. Borrowed Chinese morphemes have been used extensively in all these languages to coin compound words for new concepts, in a similar way to the use of Latin and ancient Greek roots in European languages. Many new compounds, or new meanings for old phrases, were created in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to name Western concepts and artifacts. These coinages, written in shared Chinese characters, have then been borrowed freely between languages. They have even been accepted into Chinese, a language usually resistant to loan words because their foreign origin was hidden by their written form. Often different compounds for the same concept were in circulation for some time before a winner emerged, and sometimes the final choice differed between countries. The proportion of vocabulary of Chinese origin thus tends to be greater in technical, abstract, or formal language. For example, Sino-Japanese words account for about 35% of the words in entertainment magazines, over half the words in newspapers, and 60% of the words in science magazines. Vietnam, Korea, and Japan each developed writing systems for their own languages, initially based on Chinese characters, but later replaced with the Hangul alphabet for Korean and supplemented with Kana syllabaries for Japanese, while Vietnamese continued to be written with the complex Ch-Nom script. However, these were limited to popular literature until the late 19th century. Today Japanese is written with a composite script using both Chinese characters and Kana, but Korean is written exclusively with Hangul in North Korea, and supplementary Chinese characters are increasingly rarely used in the South. Vietnamese is written with a Latin-based alphabet. Examples of loanwords in English include t from Hokkien te and kumquat from Cantonese gam1 gwat1. Varieties. Jerry Norman estimated that there are hundreds of mutually unintelligible varieties of Chinese. These varieties form a dialect continuum, in which differences in speech generally become more pronounced as distances increase, though the rate of change varies immensely. Generally, mountainous South China exhibits more linguistic diversity than the North China Plain. In parts of South China, a major city's dialect may only be marginally intelligible to close neighbors. For instance, Wuzhou is about 120 miles upstream from Guangzhou, but the Yu variety spoken there is more like that of Guangzhou than is that of Taishan, 60 miles southwest of Guangzhou and separated from it by several rivers. In parts of Fujian, the speech of neighboring counties or even villages may be mutually unintelligible. Until the late 20th century, Chinese emigrants to Southeast Asia and North America came from southeast coastal areas, where Min, Hakka, and Yu dialects are spoken. The vast majority of Chinese immigrants to North America spoke the Taishan dialect, from a small coastal area southwest of Guangzhou. Classification. Local varieties of Chinese are conventionally classified into 7 dialect groups, largely on the basis of the different evolution of Middle Chinese voiced initials. Mandarin, including Standard Chinese, Pekinese, Sichuanese, and also the Dungan language spoken in Central Asia. Wu, including Shanghainese, Suzhonese, and Wenzhounese. Gan, Xiang. Min, including Fujianese, Hainanese, Hokkien, Taiwanese and Teochew. Hakka. Yu, including Cantonese and Taishanese. The classification of Li Rong, which is used in the Language Atlas of China, distinguishes 3 further groups. Jin, previously included in Mandarin. Huizhou, previously included in Wu. Pinghua, previously included in Yu. Numbers of first language speakers. Mandarin, 847.8 million. Wu, 77.2 million. Min, 71.8 million. Yu, 60 million. Jin, 45 million. Xiang, 36 million. Hakka, 30.1 million. Gan, 20.6 million. Huzhou, 4.6 million. Pinyin, 2 million. Some varieties remain unclassified, including Danzhou dialect, Wakanghua and Shaozhou Tuhua. Standard Chinese and Diglossia Putonghua, Guoyu, often called Mandarin, is the official standard language used by the People's Republic of China, the Republic of China, and Singapore. It is based on the Beijing dialect, which is the dialect of Mandarin as spoken in Beijing. The governments of both countries intend for speakers of all Chinese speech varieties to use it as a common language of communication. Therefore, it is used in government agencies, in the media, and as a language of instruction in schools. In mainland China and Taiwan, diglossia has been a common feature. It is common for a Chinese to be able to speak 2 or even 3 varieties of the Sinitic languages together with Standard Chinese. For example, in addition to Putonghua, a resident of Shanghai might speak Shanghainese, and, if he or she grew up elsewhere, then he or she may also be likely to be fluent in the particular dialect of that local area. A native of Guangzhou may speak both Cantonese and Putonghua. In addition to Mandarin, most Taiwanese also speak Pinyin, Hakka or an Austronesian language. A Taiwanese may commonly mix pronunciations, phrases, and words from Mandarin and other Taiwanese languages, and this mixture is considered normal in daily or informal speech. Nomenclature. The official Chinese designation for the major branches of Chinese is Fangyin, whereas the more closely related varieties within these are called Didi and Fangyin. Conventional English language usage in Chinese linguistics is to use dialect for the speech of a particular place, while regional groupings like Mandarin and Wu are called dialect groups. Because varieties from different groups are not mutually intelligible, some scholars prefer to describe Wu and so on as languages. Better source needed. Jerry Norman called this practice misleading, pointing out that Wu, which itself contains many mutually unintelligible varieties, could not be properly called a single language under the same criterion, and that the same is true for each of the other groups. Mutual intelligibility is considered by some linguists to be the main criterion for determining whether varieties are separate languages or dialects of a single language, although others do not regard it as decisive, particularly when cultural factors interfere as they do with Chinese. As Campbell explains, linguists often ignore mutual intelligibility when varieties share intelligibility with a central variety, as the issue requires some careful handling when mutual intelligibility is inconsistent with language identity. John DeFrancis considers the mutual unintelligibility too great for the term dialects to be used to refer to the different varieties, but also objects to considering them as separate languages, as it incorrectly implies a set of disruptive, religious, economic, political, and other differences between speakers that exist, for example, between French Catholics and English Protestants in Canada, but not between speakers of Cantonese and Mandarin in China, owing to China's near uninterrupted history of centralized government. Because of the difficulties involved in determining the difference between language and dialect, other terms have been proposed. ISO 639-3 follows ethnologue in assigning individual language codes to the 13 main subdivisions, while Chinese as whole is classified as a macrolanguage. Other options include vernacular, lect, regional lect, topolect, and variety. Chinese itself has a term for its unified writing system, zhongwen, while the closest equivalent used to describe its spoken variants would be honey. This term could be translated to either language or languages, since Chinese lacks grammatical number. For centuries in China, owing to the widespread use of a written standard in classical Chinese, there was no uniform speech and writing continuum, as indicated by the employment of two separate morphemes U and WE acute N. The characters used in written Chinese are logographs that denote morphemes as a whole rather than the phonemes. Although most logographs are compounds of similar-sounding characters and semantic disambiguation, modern-day Chinese speakers of all kinds communicate using the modern standard written language, the written form of Standard Chinese. Most Chinese people consider the spoken varieties as one single language because speakers share a common culture and history, as well as shared national identity and a common written form. Han native speakers of Wu, Min, Hakka, and Cantonese, for instance, may consider their own linguistic varieties as distinct spoken varieties, but the Han Chinese as one, albeit internally very diverse, ethnicity. To Chinese nationalists, the idea of Chinese as a language family may suggest that the Chinese identity is much more fragmented and disunified than it actually is, and as such, is often looked upon as culturally and politically provocative. Additionally, in Taiwan it is closely associated with Taiwanese independence, some of whose supporters promote the local Taiwanese Hokkien variety.